As I've said before, my family has been plagued with terrifying interactions with these anomalous entities, known to many throughout history as shadow people. I did a bit more investigation and found that there are more stories than I thought among my family members. My eldest aunt recounted a story to me which I've heard before, but never in the context of the investigation I did for this video. She was about 10 years of age at the time, just having moved to New York from their native land of Jamaica. It was their first American home, a 2-story house with an attic, one you may already be familiar with if you've seen the first video. She shared a room on the 2nd floor with another aunt of mine, with my mother being in the next room over. From my aunt's room, she could see the banister overlooking the ground floor, leading to the side of the staircase. There was a peculiarity in the room's construction which caused the closet door to pop open whenever the room door was closed. One night, while lying in bed, waiting to fall asleep, my aunt felt a chill creeping up her neck. She shuddered in response, unsure of what may have caused it, when the closet door popped open. She stared into the dark of the hall outside the room. There was no way the closet door could have opened on its own. As she lay there, blankets gathered into a knot in front of her face, she contemplated the happenings, her mind racing to justify what she had just seen in such a way that would not involve her getting out of bed. Her eyes darted back and forth between the 2 doors when her confusion was interrupted. A faint, flickering light began to emanate from the bottom of the stairs. Its sepia tones glinted against the textures of the wall. The light grew brighter, gradually, as it appeared to ascend the steps. Her gaze was fixed on the precipice of the first step, waiting with shallow breath to see who, or what, was coming up the stairs. As the tension in her mind grew, a black silhouette shaped like a head peeked into view with an unsettling, smooth motion. Out of desperation and denial, my aunt called out for her mother and sisters, hoping that somehow it could be one of them in the stairwell. No one answered. The small ember of hope faded from her mind soon afterwards, as the rest of the figure, all made of deep shadow, revealed itself, gliding slowly up the stairs. It appeared to be holding an old brass lamp, casting the dim light. She began to breathe in quick, shallow gasps as the entity turned slowly towards her, lifting the small lamp to its face. The light seemed to simply halt where the apparition's form began, with nothing off of which to reflect. She struggled to scream, but only whimpers and muted syllables escaped her throat. She was finally able to call for her mother, my grandmother, out loud, and the creature turned and calmly glided back down the steps, the way it came. My grandmother came rushing into the room to check on her, but did not seem to believe the story and went back to her own room. Needless to say, my aunt spent the rest of that night staring into the dark of the hall. To this day, the shadow people continue to haunt her dreams, often impersonating her own children or husband, lying in their beds at night as if to fool her into accepting them. My uncle told me another story. To my surprise, it actually occurred long before the confrontation that you may have heard in the previous video. He was 6 years old, living in the same house in New York. The house was situated in a row of other houses, all of which were connected by a long back alleyway, a dirt road, 2 lanes wide, lined with overgrown trees. There was a junkyard on the other side of the tree line, with stadium lights to keep out vandals. The lights from the junkyard bled through the tree line, creating scattered, shifting columns of light shining through the leaves and dancing around the dirt road. The alleyway was frequently used to safely go from house to house, and was a popular bike riding route for the local children. One twilight evening, my grandmother told him to go all the way down to the end of the block, where his 4 sisters were spending time with a friend. He was tasked with delivering the bad news. It was time for them to come home. Being a young boy, my uncle decided to prove to himself that he could brave the alleyway at that late hour, and maybe even scare his sisters while he was at it. He began his trek through the sparsely lit wilds of the night alley. The trees moved with the wind as he walked toward the end of the block. When he was about halfway there, he saw all 4 of his sisters, holding hands, skipping along together happily down the alley in the opposite direction. As they came toward him, he continued down the path to meet them, but slowed his gait once he realized something was off about the way they looked. The first thing that struck him as odd was that they made no noise with their gleeful movement. No sounds of sneakers scraping against the ground. Then he saw that their forms were very dark, completely dark, with no highlights coming from clothing or anything else. He stopped and strained his eyes to analyze the approaching girls. He saw that the youngest one had pigtails, which gave him a mild sense of relief. The youngest of his sisters actually did, after all, have her hair styled that way. As the girls skipped along, he noticed that whenever they passed a column of light from the junkyard, still, nothing was illuminated. He did not wait any longer. The girls continued their march as he turned and took flight, his small feet barely touching the ground as he ran back through the dark alleyway to his home, jumping the fence of his backyard and bursting through the kitchen door. As he struggled to catch his breath, he looked up to see his mother scolding his 4 sisters in the kitchen for being out so late. They all looked at him with puzzled expressions as he tried to explain what had happened through his gasping breaths. They had arrived only seconds after he first left through the back door. It was my little sister who first brought to my attention the fact that shadow people and other forms of shadows can make physical contact with people and objects in our world. Recently, I asked my little sister, whom I will call Joy, to recount to me her experiences with shadow people. Though most were harmless, there seemed to be one being that returned every few years to terrify her. I never knew about this until the day I interviewed her for this video. It all started when she was just 6 years old, living in our childhood home. The same one which has been a persistent locale for my nightmares all my life, despite the wonderful childhood we all enjoyed there. You might have heard me speak of it before in my dream chronicles. There was a picturesque front room. It was the first thing you saw when entering through the front door. If you grew up in the 90s like we did, you probably know the kind of room I mean. It was one of those places where children were never supposed to venture off of the long plastic floor mat, let alone play around on the pristine carpet that always had the tracks marked into it from frequent vacuuming. There was an ornate wooden dresser, a small couch, and a never-used coffee table in the space as well. Perched atop that dresser was a white porcelain cat my mom got from a thrift store. Its painted eyes stared with a placid expression. The 4 of us children used to believe its gaze tracked us as we went about our daily lives at home. One day as she was passing by, Joy thought she saw something coming out from behind the feline figurine. She said it looked like the rear end of a live cat, but it didn't look quite right. Its appearance was misty and wavy. It seemed to pause briefly after she noticed it, and then swiftly leapt away a moment later. She began to see the same bizarre image of a cat's tail and rear legs, with the front of it always just out of view, over and over again, in various rooms of the house. She saw it so often, she began to suspect that a stray cat had snuck its way in and had been surviving on our food scraps. One day, she saw it again ducking just behind a storage trunk in the kitchen. My other little sister, whom I'll call Ray, happened to be there. 6-year-old Joy asked 4-year-old Ray if she saw anything back there, and Ray said she saw what looked like a cat's butt. The 2 children spent the next few days trying to lure the cat out, using various rudimentary and probably laughable childlike techniques. They never felt threatened by the cat's presence, but rather thought of it as a game. A few years passed without her seeing the cat, but Joy would still see shadow people every now and then, usually appearing as children wandering around the backyard. It reminded her of the way our mother used to see them, except these always seemed quite aloof, compared to the sinister ones my mom once knew. One night when Joy was about 9 years old, sleeping in a bunk bed above Ray, she kept feeling like someone below her was hanging onto the bars of the bed frame, swinging around. She complained to Ray to stop playing, but Ray insisted she wasn't doing anything. Fed up, and not believing her sister, Joy positioned herself to quickly look down and catch her in the act. When she felt the commotion again, she quickly looked down only to see that her sister was fast asleep. Almost disappointed, she laid back down facing the wall. Seconds later, she felt a large, powerful hand inching in to grasp her neck. Distinct feelings of pressure from fingers crawling their way over her skin, tightening at an alarming rate. She was immediately petrified with fear. Her eyes darted around in the darkness, unsure of where to focus. As the hand wrapped around her neck, she turned her head. The feeling vanished into thin air, and nothing was there. My family moved into another home shortly after I went away to the military. Throughout her teenage years, she would still see the shadows. For the vast majority of the time, they were generally unconcerned with her, until she turned 17, and one appeared inside the new house. She arrived from school one day to an empty home. She immediately felt uneasy upon walking through the door, as if she was being watched. She walked through the house, turning a corner to enter a long hallway, when she noticed the imposing figure of a shadow man in a doorway behind her. It stood in a threatening posture that made her even more unsettled, but she simply continued to walk away, knowing that usually the shadows meant no harm. After a few steps, she looked back and realized it was now walking behind her, matching pace. She started walking faster, and it followed suit. She started running, looked back and saw that it was now chasing her at full speed as she ran toward her room. She cut into a guest bathroom and quickly locked the door. After several minutes of waiting inside, fed up with the torment, she decided to shove the door open regardless of the outcome. Of course, he was gone. She wondered if it was the same entity that once tried to choke her in bed. Now in her 20s, Joy has seen shadow people on rare occasions. Once while working at a popular shoe store. One day while opening early, she heard something that sounded like someone jumping and landing on top of racks in the storeroom. Wood and metal clattered together as she went in to investigate. When she arrived, she saw a shadow child crouching playfully inside one of the shelves. The clear contrast of pitch black against the wood grain. The most recent and most disturbing incident happened only a year or two ago. Joy was just getting into the house, again, alone, waiting on Ray to come home from work. She was planning on going out with friends. Our parents were out of town. From the moment she entered the house, she felt that familiar presence watching her. She decided not to wait any longer and left the house, arming the alarm system. As she walked out the door, the dark presence became so pervasive that she ran to her car to escape the feeling of being exposed, and drove off. A few blocks down the road, she heard her cell phone ringing. She picked it up, looked at the screen, and saw the word home on the caller ID. She slowed the car to a crawl as she answered the phone to hear the words, "Intruder alarm. Intruder alarm," over and over again. It was the home alarm system calling. The infrared motion detectors had been tripped just moments after she left the house. My dad called her after himself receiving the automated call response, knowing that Joy was in the house. He told her the police were on their way, and to call Ray and let her know not to go home. She met up with Ray on the road and told her what happened. 2 police officers responded, and the girls let them inside to search the house. They searched every room and closet where someone could hide, and found nothing out of the ordinary. All the doors and windows were locked appropriately. Needless to say, the girls both canceled their plans and stayed home together that night. A submission from my dear friend, False Reaper. For as long as she could remember, she's been plagued with sightings and experiences with various dark entities, including shadow people. She can trace back the feelings of dread to her very earliest years, and because of this, she wasn't quite sure where to start. She told me that she normally avoids telling people about these events, for fear of ridicule, but hopes that her story can be of some use to me. I tell you, friend, you came to the right place. False Reaper has, over time, learned to live with seeing these bizarre things. It's all a part of her own personal hidden world, in that she doesn't often share the details. After all, who wants to have people thinking you're crazy? To start with, she decided to tell me about the entity that's been with her the longest. She admits that her memory is not all that great, and that she seems to have forgotten a lot of her childhood. But one thing that stands out in sharp definition is her shadow follower. The figure has even been seen by her friends on occasion. The most potent of these was at a sleepover one night, at her best friend's apartment in Anaheim, California. That night, False Reaper was sound asleep in her friend's room, along with a couple of the other girls scattered about. All was quiet except for one girl, Anna, who was awake, sitting up in bed and playing around on her computer. As she typed away on the keyboard, Anna could see through a doorway into the kitchen, which was out of focus as she stared at the bright screen. The kitchen area was faintly illuminated by the light coming in from outside, but she noticed a disturbing blot of darkness just beyond the edge of her screen. When she lifted her eyes to see what it was, she noticed a pronounced, black silhouette of a person standing in front of the refrigerator. Anna was instantly filled with dread and could not get herself to move for several minutes, as the figure seemed to stare directly at her. Eventually, she was able to slowly close the laptop and sink down into the bedsheets. Not knowing what else to do, she simply forced herself to go to sleep. The next morning, Anna told False Reaper what she saw, and False Reaper had no choice but to admit that the shadow person was known to follow her throughout her life. She explained to me that the mysterious figure had appeared to her many other times, but never more than a few minutes. She's seen it running down the halls in her house, sitting beside her bed at night, or hovering over her, appearing to watch intently as she drifts off to sleep. Unlike many shadow encounters, she never felt like the figure meant her any harm. She even has the feeling that it may have protected her from other, possibly malevolent beings. A submission from a dear friend, Brian. Many of the people who encounter shadow creatures have always known them as an unexplainable fact of life. The shadows have been around, watching them, essentially forever. This is the case with another of your fellow dreamers, Brian. He used to catch fleeting glimpses of them from a distance, popping into the world only for a few seconds before vanishing again the way they came. He found himself, in the past, able to largely brush them off as figments of his imagination. However, over the past 3 years, that began to change. In his words, things have gotten worse. It started one night. There was a full moon and not a cloud in the sky. Brian woke up from his sleep at around 2 a.m. to have a glass of water. As he walked past his dining room, he looked out the window and saw a menacing dark figure standing outside. He couldn't pick out any specific features. It was a vague, humanoid shape, which stood in contrast with the bright moonlight shining into the window. He turned on a light, and the dark form vanished instantly. Brian was admittedly freaked out. The feelings brought about from the encounter subsided as several months passed without incident. Being the kind of guy who needs noise in order to get to sleep, Brian put on an online radio show which played through the speakers of his computer. He lay down on his side, facing away from his bedroom window, and closed his eyes. Moments later, the sound on his computer suddenly cut off. His eyes shot open and darted around in the darkness. He felt a presence of seething anger and hatred emanating from the side of his bed, behind his back. The presence grew closer to his body, seeming to lean in, reaching over the bed as the paralysis of fear took his senses away. Before the terror could take hold completely, Brian lashed out, attempting to defend himself. His punch made contact with something in the dark, and he quickly rolled out of bed and turned on the lights, only to find that he had just struck a desk fan from its place. I myself know how it feels to be in the presence of a shadow person who hates you, for whatever reason. The most intense encounter Brian has had so far is also the most recent. He had been asleep for about an hour when he was awakened by the sensation of a part of his bed sinking. Near his feet, he could feel the mattress compress down under the weight of another person. He tried to ignore it, lying perfectly still and pretending no one was there. He managed to hold on to the ruse until the weight began to shift, making its way up toward his head. His systems were propelled into fight or flight. Feeling the danger at the imminent approach of the thing on his bed, he jumped up, flung his sheets toward the depression and began punching blindly. It took him a minute to realize that he was punching his bed, and he leaned over to turn the lights on, finding nothing out of place. Brian told me that he wonders if what happens to him is truly real, or if he's simply losing his mind. He said he was nervous about what may lie ahead for him. Keep listening if you want to hear my personal thoughts. I'll be including this short segment after certain stories, whenever it makes sense to do so. I see this as an opportunity to give you a bit of insight on how I see the world, and to provide more material for questions and discussions in the comments section below. I want all of my viewers to feel comfortable discussing these bizarre events amongst themselves and with me. To False Reaper, I thank you so much for your story. I know you were hesitant to share it, and you wondered if it would be of any use, but I assure you, it is of great meaning to me, and beyond me, to many others. There's no telling what effect this could have on people who may have had similar experiences in life. To Brian, thank you, my friend. I've had many encounters like this of my own, and though I could never guess how many were truly encounters with real shadow people, the unknown is a funny thing indeed. Only you know what you saw and felt during those moments of terror. Mankind has always had a visceral reaction to darkness and the unknown, one which is built into us for our own survival. What we do not have, as a whole, is the ability to understand all planes of existence. I often wonder, who's to say that we ourselves aren't the shadow people of someone else's world? If you have experiences with shadow people, dogmen, or any other anomalies you'd like to share, please do reach out to me. I very much enjoy reading your messages and talking one-on-one with each one of you. The work I do here is normally a one-way arrangement, so it's nice to hear from a fellow believer every now and then. So hey, drop me a line if it tickles your fancy. Until next time, my friends, I'm Mr. X, and may your nights be full of dreams. Syllables escaped her throat. She was finally able to call for her mother, my grandmother, out loud, and the creature turned and calmly glided back down the steps, the way it came. My grandmother came rushing into the room to check on her, but did not seem to believe the story and went back to her own room. Needless to say, my aunt spent the rest of that night staring into the dark of the hall. To this day, the shadow people continue to haunt her dreams, often impersonating her own children or husband, lying in their beds at night as if to fool her into accepting them. My uncle told me another story. To my surprise, it actually occurred long before the confrontation that you may have heard in the previous video. Smooth motion. Out of desperation and denial, my aunt called out for her mother and sisters, hoping that somehow it could be one of them in the stairwell. No one answered. The small ember of hope faded from her mind soon afterwards, as the rest of the figure, all made of deep shadow, revealed itself, gliding slowly up the stairs. It appeared to be holding an old brass lamp, casting the dim light. She began to breathe in quick, shallow gasps as the entity turned slowly towards her, lifting the small lamp to its face. The light seemed to simply halt where the apparition's form began, with nothing off of which to reflect. She struggled to scream, but only whimpers and muted, one you may already be familiar with if you've seen the first video. She shared a room on the second floor with another aunt of mine, with my mother being in the next room over. From my aunt's room, she could see the banister overlooking the ground floor, leading to the side of the staircase. There was a peculiarity in the room's construction which caused the closet door to pop open whenever the room door was closed. One night, while lying in bed, waiting to fall asleep, my aunt felt a chill creeping up her neck. She shuddered in response, unsure of what may have caused it, when the closet door popped open. She stared into the dark of the hall outside the room. There was no way the closet door could have opened on its own. As she lay there, blankets gathered into a knot in front of her face, she contemplated the happenings, her mind racing to justify what she had just seen in such a way that would not involve her getting out of bed. Her eyes darted back and forth between the two doors when her confusion was interrupted. A faint, flickering light began to emanate from the bottom of the stairs. Its sepia tones glinted against the textures of the wall. The light grew brighter, gradually, as it appeared to ascend the steps. Her gaze was fixed on the precipice of the first step, waiting with shallow breath to see who, or what, was coming up the stairs. As the tension in her mind grew, a black silhouette shaped like a head peeked into view with an unsettling As I've said before, my family has been plagued with terrifying interactions with these anomalous entities, known to many throughout history as shadow people. I did a bit more investigation and found that there are more stories than I thought among my family members. My eldest aunt recounted a story to me which I've heard before, but never in the context of the investigation I did for this video. She was about 10 years of age at the time, just having moved to New York from their native land of Jamaica. It was their first American home, a 2-story house with an attic.